Birthdays are supposed to arrive with certainty, with warmth, with the quiet assurance that the life you have built still recognizes you. Nia Carter had believed that once. On the morning of her 33rd birthday, sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors of their Boston brownstone, gentle and deliberate, as if the day itself had practiced its entrance. A card waited on the kitchen counter, propped carefully against a vase of lilies. Ethan's handwriting curved across the envelope, steady, familiar, rehearsed by years of signing documents worth more than most people's homes. Tonight, our place, just us. The words should have softened her. They almost did. Nia stood there longer than necessary, still in her robe, coffee cooling in her hands. There was nothing overtly wrong with the message, nothing that could be named or accused. And yet, beneath the calm surface of the morning, something tugged at her. Quiet, persistent, unwelcome. It felt like standing on a floor that looked solid but didn't sound right when you stepped. She tried to shake it off. She always did. At work, colleagues surprised her with a small cake in the break room, candles bending under the air conditioner's hum. They hugged her, praised her latest court victory, joked that she never seemed to age. Someone called her inspiring. Another called her unbreakable. Nia smiled, accepted the compliments with grace, and wondered when strength had become something people admired without ever asking what it cost. All day her phone buzzed with polite affection. Messages timed perfectly, too perfectly. Ethan checked in once, just once, long enough to appear attentive, short enough to remain unavailable. By early evening, Nia left the office before the others noticed the clock. She told herself she was eager, that she wanted this night to be good, that marriage, like everything else worth keeping, required patience. Still, as she rode home through familiar streets, a strange heaviness settled behind her ribs. Not fear, not suspicion, something colder, something quieter. The brownstone greeted her with its usual composure, brick facade, orderly windows, a home designed to appear untroubled by the lives unfolding inside it. Nia unlocked the door just after 7, heels in hand, the city's noise fading behind her. That was when she heard it, a laugh. Female, light, unconcerned. It floated down the staircase, careless and alive, followed by a voice she knew too well, low, intimate, unguarded in a way it hadn't been with her for months. Nia didn't move. In that suspended moment, she understood something with devastating clarity. The body often knows long before the heart is ready to admit the truth. Every unanswered question, every postponed conversation, every night she'd convinced herself not to ask for more, suddenly aligned into a single, undeniable shape. She didn't scream. She didn't rush forward. She simply stood there, breathing evenly, as if her life had not just split itself cleanly in two. Later, she would remember this moment not for the sounds she heard upstairs, but for the one thing she didn't hear at all. Herself begging. If this beginning already feels like it's tightening something in your chest, stay with the story. Sometimes the quietest moments are the ones that change everything. And if you're listening closely, if you've ever felt that instinct whisper before the truth arrived, you might want to leave a small sign that you were here. A like, a thought in the comments, a follow, so you don't miss what comes next. Because this isn't the story of a woman who didn't know. It's the story of a woman who finally stopped ignoring what she did. The gift arrived just before noon, carried in by the building's security guard with the careful politeness reserved for objects that announce importance before they are even opened. Nia recognized the box instantly, not by its brand, but by its intention. It was too considered, too perfectly timed, like a line delivered in the second act of a play meant to redirect suspicion. She thanked the guard, closed the door, and stood alone in the quiet of the entryway, the weight of the box balanced in her palms. Outside, the city continued as it always did. Buses exhaling at the curb, a siren somewhere distant, the soft percussion of a life that did not know it was being rearranged. The ribbon slid free without resistance. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a bracelet, simple in design, luminous in execution. The kind of peace meant to suggest intimacy rather than extravagance. "I know you," it said. "I pay attention." A small card lay beneath it. "For tonight," Ethan had written. "I miss us." The words landed gently. That was the problem. They landed the way apologies often do when they're not meant to fix anything, only to delay consequences. Nia sat at the edge of the sofa and turned the bracelet between her fingers. It caught the light, reflected it back in calm, obedient lines. She imagined wearing it later, imagined Ethan noticing it on her wrist, imagined the brief relief that would cross his face when he realized she had accepted the offering. She hated herself for how close she came to letting that be enough. There had been a time when gestures like this would have undone her completely, when she would have read the card 3 times, smiled at nothing, texted a heart in response. Back when affection still felt like a language they both spoke fluently, before it became something she translated alone. She slipped the bracelet on anyway. It rested perfectly against her skin, cool at first, then warming as if it had always belonged there. The sensation stirred something dangerously familiar, a hope she had spent months teaching herself to manage. Perhaps tonight would be different. Perhaps this was Ethan's way back toward her. Perhaps the distance had been temporary, the silence unintentional. Hope, she had learned, didn't need logic to survive. It only needed a small opening. At work, Nia buried herself in preparation for an afternoon hearing, her mind sharp, her voice steady, her arguments precise. In the courtroom, she was unquestionable. She spoke with clarity, with authority, with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she stood. The judge ruled in her favor. A client squeezed her hand in gratitude. Colleagues nodded with respect. No one there could see the bracelet beneath her sleeve, or the quiet calculation happening beneath her composure. During a break, her phone lit up. "Running a little late," Ethan texted. "Don't wait for me. I'll make it up to you." The message was brief, polite, designed to sound busy rather than distant. Nia stared at it longer than necessary, aware of the familiar pattern, how often late had replaced present, how often promises had softened into intentions without ever becoming actions. Still, she typed back something light, something forgiving. "Take your time." She read the words after they sent, feeling the familiar tightening in her chest. Not anger, not yet, just the quiet knowledge that love, when stretched too thin, begins to resemble permission. As evening settled over the city, Nia gathered her things and prepared to leave. The bracelet glinted as she reached for her coat, beautiful and unassuming, a symbol of care that asked for nothing in return except belief. She paused at the door, one hand resting against the wood, and wondered, briefly, how many women before her had accepted gifts like this? How many had mistaken them for bridges instead of barricades? Outside, the sky darkened with theatrical grace, the kind that made everything feel more meaningful than it was. Nia stepped into the night, carrying a hope she no longer trusted, wrapped in gold, and offered just convincingly enough to make her doubt her own unease. Later, she would understand the truth with startling precision. Some gifts aren't meant to be worn. They're meant to buy time. There were 2 versions of Nia Carter, and most people only ever met the first. That Nia moved through the world with an ease that looked like confidence, but was, in truth, discipline. She wore her competence the way other women wore perfume, subtle, unmistakable, lingering long after she'd left the room. In court, she spoke with a calm that made grown men lower their eyes. In meetings, she listened like someone who could hear what people didn't say. In the quiet spaces between arguments and evidence, she carried the kind of authority you couldn't purchase or marry into. People trusted her because she made trust feel safe. The second Nia lived where no one applauded, behind the closed doors of a brownstone that smelled faintly of cedar and expensive candles Ethan liked to light when he remembered atmosphere mattered. She lived in the pauses, in the silences that followed questions she no longer asked, in the careful way she learned to read the mood in Ethan's shoulders before she read his words. That Nia doubted herself. It was the most humiliating part, not that her marriage had grown cold, but that she had started to wonder if she was the one inventing the chill. In her office downtown, the walls were covered in framed photos from cases she'd won. Tenants holding keys to apartments they'd been told they'd never get back. Immigrant workers smiling through tears after settlements that meant their children could breathe easier. Nia never displayed those pictures as trophies. She displayed them like reminders, proof that the world could be made fairer if you refused to accept the first version of any story. And yet, at home, she accepted a story that kept shifting under her feet. On the day after the bracelet arrived, she wore it under her sleeve during a meeting with junior attorneys. When she gestured, the gold caught light for half a second, an almost secret flash. One of the interns noticed and smiled. "Your husband spoils you," she said, gentle admiration softening her voice. Nia returned the smile with practiced grace. She didn't correct her. She didn't explain that the bracelet felt less like affection and more like a seal placed on her wrist, quietly marking her as handled. When people spoke of Ethan Caldwell, they did it the way they spoke of men with shining resumes and polished manners. They called him charming, strategic, visionary. They said he had a good heart beneath the ambition, that he was generous when it counted, that he made the right rooms open. To strangers, he was the kind of man a woman was supposed to be proud of. To Nia, he had become something harder to name, a man who still knew how to perform love, even when he no longer lived inside it. The change hadn't been sudden. It never is. It had arrived in increments so small they could be dismissed as adulthood. Busy seasons, stress, the weight of responsibility, his travel, the late dinners that turned into late nights, the way his phone began to live face down on every table, like a quiet vow of secrecy. At first, she tried to reach him with softness, candles, music, a weekend away that she planned down to the smallest detail because she refused to let their intimacy die from negligence. Ethan came, smiled, touched her shoulder with the gentleness of a man petting a beloved animal, and then spent half the trip checking messages. After that, she tried clarity. "I miss you," she said once, more honest than proud. "I feel alone even when you're here." Ethan had looked at her as if she'd spoken a foreign language. "You're never alone," he replied, and kissed her forehead the way you reassure someone who's anxious, not someone you desire. Then she tried silence. Not the strategic kind, just the tired kind. The kind that comes from realizing you've been carrying the emotional labor of two people and no longer have the strength to pretend it's romantic. In public, none of it showed. At a fundraiser for legal aid, Nia and Ethan arrived together, her in a satin dress the color of midnight, him in a suit tailored to look effortless. He wrapped an arm around her waist when cameras appeared. He introduced her as his wife, with pride that sounded real enough to make others believe it was. And in those moments, she almost believed it too. Not because it was true, but because she needed it to be. Because the world loved a woman who had it all. A formidable career, a beautiful marriage, a life framed in stability. The world did not know what to do with a woman who won cases by day and went home at night to the slow erasure of intimacy. In the car afterward, the city lights sliding across the windshield like fleeting confessions, Ethan asked if she'd had a good night. Nia watched the reflections move over her hands, over the bracelet that had become her quiet companion, and felt the question settle in her chest like a stone. "Yes," she said. It was the answer the first Nia would give. The second Nia, the wife who doubted, stayed silent behind her teeth, staring out at Boston's calm streets and thinking of how strange it was to be so trusted by everyone, and yet feel so uncertain in the one place she was supposed to be safest. She rested her head against the window, letting the cold glass soothe her temple, and wondered, without wanting to, whether the life she defended so brilliantly for others was the one she was failing to defend for herself. Quiet can be comforting when it belongs to peace, but the silence that greeted Nia Carter when she stepped into the brownstone that evening was not the kind that cradled you. It was the kind that watched, the kind that waited. She closed the door behind her with care, as if any sudden noise might disturb the delicate illusion her life had been balanced on. The entryway smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and the cedar candle Ethan liked. A warm, curated scent meant to suggest home, meant to erase anything raw or human. Her heels made a soft, obedient sound against the wood as she crossed the hall, coat still on, keys still in her hand. It was too early for Ethan to be back. He'd said he was running late. He always said that. Nia turned on the lamp near the staircase, and the room filled with a gentle, amber glow. Shadows softened. The polished surfaces of their life, framed art, neatly stacked books, the bowl of fresh lemons that existed mostly for aesthetic, looked as they always did, composed, expensive, serene. And yet, underneath it, something was wrong. The air was warmer than it should have been for early autumn. Not the warmth of heating, but the warmth of bodies that had been moving recently, of life happening where it shouldn't. Nia stood still for a moment, listening. The house answered her with nothing. No footsteps, no clink of glass, no familiar rhythm of Ethan's presence, only stillness. She placed her bag on the console table and slid her bracelet up her wrist, exposing the gold links to the light. They glimmered briefly, beautiful and indifferent. A gift that had promised tenderness now felt like a small, elegant lie. She told herself she was imagining things, that a quiet house was simply a quiet house. Still, she didn't call out his name. That, she realized with a strange detachment, was new. There was a time she would have announced herself from the doorway, voice bright, offering the kind of warmth women are trained to provide, even when they're tired. There was a time she would have tried to sound happy, because happiness was a form of currency in a marriage, something you spent to buy more affection. Tonight, her throat stayed still. Nia moved deeper into the house, her steps slow, measured. The living room lay in perfect order, the throw blanket folded just so, the coffee table empty, no signs of chaos, no evidence of anyone living a real life here. Only the careful neatness of a space maintained by effort. She glanced toward the kitchen. A single wine glass sat in the sink, rinsed but not put away. The sight should have been insignificant, but her mind, sharp from years of courtroom instincts, registered it as detail. Ethan didn't drink wine from a glass that delicate. He always used the heavier ones, the ones that felt masculine in his hand. And he never rinsed anything. Not because he was cruel, but because he believed small tasks belonged to the category of things that happened without him. Nia stared at the glass until her pulse shifted. Maybe a friend had stopped by. Maybe the cleaning service had used it. Maybe it was nothing. She had lived long enough to know that maybe was a dangerous place to stand. It was where women waited while their lives were quietly rearranged. She slipped her coat off, hung it on the rack. The movement felt like a concession, like telling the house she planned to stay. She didn't. Upstairs, the second floor held their bedroom. Her bedroom, she corrected herself softly, because something in her refused to call it theirs too easily. The hallway above was dark, but a thin line of light cut from beneath the bedroom door. Not bright, not obvious, a careless glow. Nia's fingers tightened around the banister as she climbed the first step. The wood was smooth under her palm, worn by generations of hands, by a history that belonged to them only because Ethan's name was on the deed and her name was on the illusion. Her breath came in quietly, evenly, each inhale controlled. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the body preparing itself to witness something it had suspected but refused to name. Halfway up, she heard it. A sound so small it might have been imagined, then unmistakable, then immediate. A laugh. A woman's laugh, bright and breathy. The kind of sound that carries ease, not caution. For a heartbeat, Nia's mind tried to protect her. It offered possibilities like peace offerings, a podcast, a video, a call. Then Ethan's voice followed, low and intimate, softened by warmth that did not belong to her anymore. "I've missed this," he murmured, and Nia felt something inside her go still. "I've missed you." The house didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt loud with betrayal. Nia stood on the step, frozen in a posture that looked almost prayerful, hands on the banister, head slightly bowed, as if she could ask the universe for a different truth. The bracelet on her wrist caught the light from downstairs and flashed once, gold against her skin like a mark. She didn't move, not because she was weak, because in that moment, she was doing something she had never done before. She was listening without bargaining, without denying, without searching for excuses to keep her heart from breaking. Upstairs, the woman laughed again, closer now, a sound that belonged in a different life, in a different house, in a different story. And Nia understood, with devastating clarity, why the house had felt too quiet when she arrived. Because it wasn't empty, it was hiding something. She swallowed, steadying herself against the banister, and felt the world narrow into a single, razor-thin question. How long has this been happening? While I've been trying so hard to be loved. There are moments when your life splits with such clean precision, you can almost hear the seam. Nia didn't make a sound. She didn't rush the remaining steps like a woman in a movie, hair flying, heart spilling everywhere. She didn't throw open a door. She didn't demand explanations as if truth had ever needed her permission to exist. Instead, she stood on the staircase and let the scene assemble itself in her mind with the brutal clarity of evidence. A woman upstairs, in her home, in the room where she kept her winter sweaters folded like small promises, and her perfume lined up like quiet rituals. Ethan's voice, soft, indulgent, familiar in a way it hadn't been with her for far too long. The warmth in his tone wasn't stolen from her. It was simply withheld until he found someone who didn't require him to be faithful to feel powerful. Nia's first instinct was not rage. It was a strange, icy calm, as if her body had decided it would not grant this betrayal the dignity of theatrics. She lowered her gaze to her own hands. The bracelet gleamed at her wrist, the gift from earlier, the one that had said, "I miss us," as if us were a real place Ethan still lived. For a moment, she felt a sharp, humiliating tenderness because she had wanted to believe him. She had wanted to be the kind of woman who could be surprised by love on her birthday, not the kind of woman who had to prepare herself for disappointment the way she prepared for court, with documents, strategy, a spine made of steel. The tenderness didn't break her. It burned away. Downstairs, the lamp cast a soft circle of light across the entryway, and beyond it the house stretched in ordered perfection, everything arranged to look like a life that made sense. She thought of the wine glass in the sink, the faint warmth in the air, the thin strip of light beneath the bedroom door, the quiet, all the clues she'd noticed without allowing herself to name what they meant. She inhaled slowly, not to steady herself, she already was steady, but to mark the last breath of the version of herself who still believed she could rescue a man from his own emptiness. From upstairs, the woman spoke, her voice drifting down like perfume. "We can't keep doing this," she said, and there was a softness to it, an almost performative guilt. Ethan responded with a low chuckle that made Nia's stomach tighten. Not from jealousy, but from recognition. Recognition of arrogance. "Relax," he murmured. "She won't be home for hours." Nia didn't blink. She had defended clients who'd been lied to by landlords with charming voices and clean hands. She had cross-examined executives who said, "Relax," to women, as if women existed to be managed. She had learned the architecture of male entitlement, not from books, but from living in a country that taught men their comfort mattered more than women's reality. And still, she had somehow believed love would exempt her. The sentence upstairs continued, casual and cruel. "She always waits," Ethan said, the words thick with certainty. "That's who she is." The switch flipped then. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with fireworks. It came like a door closing quietly inside her chest. Nia felt something detach, something fragile and faithful she had been carrying like a candle through wind for too long. She'd protected it, cup-shaped her hands around it, walked carefully so it wouldn't go out. And with one thoughtless line from Ethan's mouth, she realized she was tired of being the woman who protected flames that weren't meant for her. Her mind sharpened. Not into vengeance, she wasn't interested in chaos, but into focus, clean and unshakable. The part of her that argued cases for a living rose calmly to the surface, and it didn't ask why. It asked, "What now?" She stepped down one stair, then another. Her bare hands slid along the banister, steady as a metronome. She moved as if she were leaving a room where the air had become toxic, as if she finally understood that staying to witness more would only invite pain to become a spectacle. In the entryway, she reached down and loosened the straps of her heels. The motion was simple, almost tender, like unfastening something that had been hurting without her noticing. One shoe, then the other. She placed them on the floor gently, precisely, lined up with the same discipline she used when she organized trial folders. The quiet act felt like a declaration. She would not run. She would not stumble. She would not give this moment the chaos of her tears. Upstairs, the bed creaked, an ugly, intimate sound that would have shattered her once. Tonight, it only clarified. Nia stood with her feet on the cool wood, and for the first time in what felt like years, she felt fully awake. She did not scream, because screaming would make this about emotion. And Ethan had already proven he used emotion as a tool, something to bait, to soothe, to control. If she screamed, he could call her hysterical. If she cried, he could call her unstable. If she begged, he could call her needy. No, she had learned too much in her life to hand her dignity to a man who would spend it like pocket change. Her eyes found the hallway mirror, and in it she saw herself, face calm, lips parted slightly, pupils dark and steady. The bracelet flashed again at her wrist, a bright little lie. Nia lifted her arm and unclasped it. The metal slid free with a whisper, soft as a secret. For a moment, she held it in her palm and thought about how love had been offered to her so often as an object. A gift, a gesture, a performance. Something shiny enough to distract from the absence of devotion. She placed the bracelet on the console table by the door, where it gleamed in the lamplight like a confession waiting to be used. Then she turned, not toward the stairs, not toward the bedroom, not toward the version of herself who would have demanded answers. She turned deeper into the house, toward Ethan's study. Because there are women who respond to betrayal with fire, and there are women who respond with something far more dangerous, silence, sharpened into strategy. Nia moved through the hallway the way she moved through a courtroom when the verdict was already inevitable. Quiet, upright, unhurried. The house around her looked unchanged, still performing its role as a sanctuary with polished surfaces and carefully chosen art. But she felt the shift in it, the way you can feel a room's temperature change when someone lies inside it. Upstairs, the laughter softened into murmurs, the occasional creak of wood, the muted intimacy of two people who believed they were alone. Nia let the sounds pass over her like rain. Not because they didn't cut, but because she refused to let them become the whole story. A betrayal could be loud, hotel receipts, lipstick on collars, perfume in the wrong air. But the most devastating betrayals weren't about bodies. They were about contempt. She reached the corner where Ethan's study door sat slightly recessed, half hidden behind a framed photograph from a gala she barely remembered attending. Ethan in a tuxedo, Nia in a dark dress, his arm around her waist like possession, her smile so controlled it looked almost serene. In the picture, they appeared to be a couple people envied. Nia looked at that version of herself and felt something ache, not with longing, but with grief for her own innocence. She had been faithful to a concept, not to the man. She placed her hand on the study doorknob, then she paused, because the words upstairs changed. Avery. Nia didn't yet know her name, didn't yet know the shape of her life, spoke softly, as if trying on conscience the way women are taught to do. "We can't keep doing this," she said again, and this time the sentence carried a tremor that sounded almost real. It's not fair." Nia closed her eyes for half a heartbeat. Not fair. The phrase hovered like perfume, sweet, diffuse, meant to soften the ugliness of what it described. Not fair to whom? Not fair to the wife downstairs, who had been holding a marriage together with the patience of a saint and the discipline of a soldier? Not fair to the woman upstairs, who laughed and undressed and pretended the line between desire and harm was someone else's responsibility. Ethan answered with the easy confidence of a man who didn't believe consequences could ever reach him. "Come here," he murmured, and his voice was warm, indulgent, like the version of him Nia used to beg herself to remember. "You're overthinking." There was a small silence, then the woman's breath, closer, softer. "What if she comes home?" Avery asked. Nia felt her hand tighten on the doorknob, not from fear, but from anticipation. The way your body braces for impact, even when your mind already knows what's coming. Ethan laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It wasn't even a cruel one at first. It was the laugh of a man who was comfortable. "Home?" he repeated, amused. "She's not coming home." There was a pause, and then he said it. The line that didn't just break the illusion, but shattered the entire architecture of the life Nia had been building around it. "She'll wait," Ethan said, almost fondly, as if describing a reliable service, not a human being. "She always waits. That's who she is." Nia didn't breathe. She felt the sentence land in her body like a verdict. Not because he'd cheated. Infidelity was a knife, yes, but a knife you could at least recognize. What Ethan had just done was something worse. He had reduced her to a habit, a function, a certainty so complete it made her invisible. In that one sentence, Nia heard every evening she'd stayed up past midnight, pretending she wasn't checking the clock. Every dinner she'd warmed twice, then packed away untouched. Every time she'd asked softly if he was okay, and he'd responded with a distracted, "Fine," as if her care were background noise. He didn't love her enough to be faithful, but he trusted her enough to be obedient. The thought was nauseating. Nia opened her eyes and stared down the dark hallway. The banister's shadow cut across the wall like a blade. She thought of her clients, women who stayed because leaving was expensive, because starting over was terrifying, because society treated loneliness as a failure. Women who were told to be patient, to be graceful, to communicate better, as if betrayal were a misunderstanding and not a choice. Nia had repeated those sentences to herself too, in kinder words. "He's under pressure. He'll come back to you. Marriage has seasons. Don't be dramatic." And now, upstairs, Ethan was making a joke out of her devotion. He wasn't just doing something wrong. He was doing it with confidence. Nia's mouth went dry, and for a brief moment her heart tried to protest, tried to turn this into an argument she could win by loving harder. She could confront him. She could demand truth. She could make him look at her, make him remember. She could cry if she had to. She could. No, the switch inside her had already flipped, and this line sealed it in place. Because if she confronted him now, he would do what men like Ethan always did when caught. He would recast reality. He would say she was paranoid. He would say she was working too much. He would say she neglected him. He would say the marriage had been dying anyway. He would frame her strength as coldness, her ambition as absence, her dignity as distance. And people would nod because people loved narratives that punished women for not being easy to betray. Nia felt something settle behind her ribs, dense, dark, steady, not rage, not hysteria, a clean resolve, like ink drying on paper. She released the doorknob and stepped away, her bare feet silent on the wood. Upstairs, Ethan's voice lowered again, intimate and satisfied, as if he had just offered comfort, as if his cruelty were kindness. Nia moved toward the study with a composure that would have terrified anyone who understood what it meant. Because she wasn't walking toward a confrontation. She was walking toward clarity. And once a woman stops pleading for a man to see her, she becomes something he can't negotiate with. On the wall, the framed photograph caught her reflection as she passed. Nia in shadow, eyes bright and unreadable. A woman halfway between the life she'd been living and the life she was about to claim. The illusion hadn't broken because she saw him with another woman. It broke because she heard how small he believed she was. And in the silence that followed, Nia Carter became impossible to underestimate. Ethan's study had always been a room with rules. Not spoken rules, those would have implied honesty, but the kind of quiet boundaries that settle into a marriage when one person begins to treat privacy as power. The door was usually closed. The desk was always immaculate. The shelves were filled with books chosen more for how they looked than how they read. Even the leather chair seemed to hold itself upright, as if slouching would be an insult to the man who owned it. Nia had passed that door 1,000 times. She had done it with the polite restraint of someone who respected spaces that weren't hers. She had done it with the same instinct that made her knock before entering a room, even when she had every right to walk in. She had done it because love to her meant honor. It meant not turning your partner into a suspect. And that, she understood now, was exactly why the study existed as a fortress. Because Ethan never believed she would cross the line. Tonight, she crossed it without hesitation. The handle was cool beneath her palm, the metal polished by years of his casual touch. The door opened with a soft click that sounded almost like permission. Inside, the air was different, thicker, faintly scented with cedar, and something sharper, the aftertrace of cologne and expensive paper. The room felt like Ethan's mind, controlled, curated, designed to impress. A desk lamp threw a narrow pool of light over a stack of folders. A framed degree hung on the wall, its gold seal catching the glow. Photographs of smiling men in tailored suits stood beside a small bronze sculpture. Tasteful, abstract, the sort of object people bought to signal depth. Nia stepped in and shut the door behind her. The click was quiet, but in her body, it sounded like a gate locking. Upstairs, the house continued its secret. A murmur of voices, a laugh that rose and fell like a careless ribbon. Nia didn't let herself imagine details. She didn't need them. Her work had trained her to separate emotion from action, to understand that the truth didn't require a dramatization to be real. Her eyes moved over the room with a lawyer's precision. A laptop sat closed to the right of the desk, sleek, unremarkable, the kind of machine that contained entire lives. Beside it, a second phone rested face down on a leather blotter, as if it were sleeping. Nia's throat tightened at the sight, not because she was surprised, but because the evidence was suddenly so simple. She picked up the phone. It was warm. Not the warmth of a charging cable. The warmth of use. A small, quiet detail. The sort of detail courts were built on. Nia turned it over. The screen lit, demanding a passcode. She stared at it for a moment, feeling the old version of herself. The woman who believed that crossing this line would make her lesser, rise up like a protest. "Don't do this," that voice whispered. "You'll hate yourself." Nia held the phone steady and answered the voice in silence. "I already hate what I've been tolerating." She tried the code Ethan had used for years, an anniversary date she'd once thought was romantic in its predictability. The screen unlocked. Of course it did. The arrogance of it was almost tender in its stupidity. Ethan had built his entire life on the assumption that Nia's dignity would protect him from her curiosity. He hadn't updated his passwords because he hadn't updated his respect. Nia set the phone down and opened the laptop. The machine hummed awake, the screen reflecting the lower half of her face, lips pressed, chin still, eyes unreadable. She entered his login the way she entered a courthouse, not asking to be welcomed, simply using the access she had been given and never expected to use against him. A folder labeled Personal sat on the desktop, casually hidden among spreadsheets and investor decks. She clicked it. Inside were subfolders with names so ordinary they were almost insulting. Travel, receipts, notes, calendar. Nia felt a flicker of something like laughter in her chest, sharp and bitter. He had categorized his betrayal the way he categorized his business. Clean divisions, neat labels, everything manageable. She opened Calendar. A list appeared. Hotel names, reservations, time blocks that didn't match his claimed meetings. Cities he'd said he visited for conferences. Restaurants he'd mentioned offhand, as if sharing his day. There were repeated patterns, Thursday evenings, certain dates bracketed by sudden work trips. Her pulse remained calm. Her mind did not. In law school, they teach you that a pattern is stronger than a claim. Anyone can deny one event. A pattern is a signature. Nia opened receipts, the screen filled with PDFs, confirmations, emails forwarded from one account to another. The language was always the same: discreet, polished, confident. Not a man stumbling into desire, but a man scheduling it. She thought of the bracelet on the console table downstairs, shining like a prop. She thought of Ethan upstairs saying, "She always waits." She began taking photographs with her phone, methodically capturing each file name, each timestamp, each email header. Evidence gathered with the same careful attention she used when she built cases for women who had been dismissed, minimized, told they were overreacting. Nia knew exactly what the world did to women who came forward with pain. It asked them to prove it, so she proved it. From upstairs, a thud, soft, muffled, followed by a quick burst of laughter. Nia's fingers paused on the keyboard for only a second before continuing. She refused to let the sound rearrange her focus. She opened a document titled Notes. It was a list, not a journal, not remorse, not confusion. A list. Names, abbreviated, dates, brief descriptions. Nia's stomach turned, not with jealousy, but with nausea at the cold efficiency of it. Each line reduced a woman to an entry. Each entry reduced a marriage to a cover story. She scrolled. The list wasn't short. Her breath changed then, just slightly. The smallest crack in the composure. Not because her pride had been wounded, because the scale of the deception meant her life hadn't been neglected. It had been actively managed. Managed like risk. Managed like reputation. And suddenly Nia understood why Ethan's love had felt less like a home and more like a performance. Because while she had been fighting in court to protect people from exploitation, she had been sleeping beside a man who believed exploitation was simply one more thing clever men got away with. Her eyes caught on a name that repeated more than the others. A Shaw. There were dates beside it, recent ones, closer together, intensifying. Nia clicked into a chain of messages. The tones shifted, more intimate, more urgent. Ethan wasn't just arranging, he was promising. He was weaving a future with someone else, while using his marriage as a stable platform beneath his lies. A message from Ethan stared back at her, crisp and confident. "Give me a little time. I'm handling it. She won't blow this up if I stay ahead of it." Nia stared at the sentence until it blurred slightly at the edges. He had known she might discover him. He had planned for it. And still, he had underestimated her. A sound upstairs, water running now, the shower turned on, told her the scene was shifting. The woman was likely preparing to leave. Ethan was likely preparing to erase. Good, Nia thought, and felt the calm return like a blade sliding back into its sheath. Time. He had given her time. She worked faster, not frantic, just efficient. She copied key files onto a drive she found in his drawer. She photographed the notes list. She opened the second phone again and found messages, pet names, rendezvous, reassurance, all of it saved, all of it secured. When she finally stepped back from the desk, the room looked unchanged. The lamp still glowed. The folders still sat neatly stacked. Ethan's polished life still performed respectability, but the truth was no longer hiding behind his closed door. It was in Nia's hands now. And as she turned to leave, she glanced once more at the wall where their framed gala photograph hung. Ethan smiling beside her as if he had ever deserved the woman in the image. Nia didn't hate him in that moment. Hate required intimacy. What she felt was colder, clearer, and far more final. She felt the beginning of freedom. And freedom, she was learning, often starts in the one room they never thought you'd enter. Nia closed the study door behind her and stood very still, as if the house itself needed a moment to catch up with what had just been uncovered. Upstairs, the water continued to run. A private, domestic sound. Intimate. Ordinary. It might have been comforting once. Now it felt like noise designed to erase traces, to wash away the evidence of something that had never been accidental. She didn't return to the staircase immediately. Instead, she leaned her back against the door of the study, the wood cool through her dress, and let the truth settle. Not as a blow, but as a shape. Clear, undeniable. It wasn't one woman. That was the lie she had almost believed. The version of betrayal that allowed for explanations. A moment of weakness, a mistake, a crisis of intimacy that could be talked through if both parties were willing to be honest enough and heard enough. But this wasn't that. This was design. Nia walked back to the desk and opened the laptop again, this time not searching for shock, but for confirmation. Her fingers moved with quiet purpose, following threads the way she followed arguments in complex cases, looking not at what was loud, but at what repeated. Dates, cities, hotels that appeared again and again like punctuation marks in a sentence he'd been writing for years. She noticed the spacing first. The intervals were almost elegant in their consistency. Enough distance between encounters to avoid suspicion. Enough regularity to maintain momentum. This wasn't desire spilling over. It was maintenance. The messages changed tone depending on the recipient. Some were flirtatious and light, written in a voice that pretended spontaneity. Others were careful, reassuring, threaded with promises that sounded like plans, but were never anchored to reality. Soon, when things settle, you know how complicated this is. Nia had heard variations of those sentences before, from Ethan, directed at her. Her throat tightened, not with jealousy, but with recognition. He hadn't invented a new language for these women. He had recycled one he already knew worked. She opened another chain, then another. The pattern grew denser, undeniable. Different names, different ages, different contexts, but the same Ethan in every line. Controlled, strategic, always positioning himself as the man caught between responsibility and desire. As if responsibility were a trap laid for him, rather than a life he had chosen. One message stood out, not for its romance, but for its cruelty. "You're not like her," he had written to one woman. "You make me feel alive." Nia stared at the sentence until it lost meaning. She thought of the nights she had stayed up waiting, convincing herself that patience was maturity. Thought of the mornings she had left for work quietly so as not to wake him, believing consideration was love. Thought of the ways she had shrunk her own needs so his could continue to take up all the air in the room. Alive. What he had meant was unaccountable. She scrolled further. There were cancellations too, messages that ended abruptly, conversations that cooled without explanation, women who had likely begun to ask for more than he was willing to give, women who had stopped being convenient. Ethan didn't explode relationship. He phased them out. Nia exhaled slowly, her breath steadying against the sharp edge of that understanding. This wasn't a story about passion overtaking judgment. This was a man who used intimacy the way he used capital, deploying it where it benefited him most, withdrawing when the cost rose too high. Her eyes returned to the names she had noticed before. A Shaw. The messages with Avery were different, more frequent, less guarded. There were jokes, shared frustrations, references to work meetings that bled into something else. Ethan had been careless here, not because he loved Avery more, but because the pattern had convinced him he was untouchable. In one exchange, Avery had written, "I don't want to be someone's secret." Ethan's response followed minutes later. "You're not. I just need time to cleanly untangle things." Cleanly. As if marriages were knots you loosen without friction. As if wives were obstacles, not people. As if Nia herself were a logistical problem waiting to be solved. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad, then moved again, taking photographs of the messages, capturing the cadence of his lies. She knew instinctively that truth lived not in any single line, but in accumulation. Courts understood that. So did women who had been gaslit long enough to doubt their own memory. Nia straightened, the weight of it settling fully now. This wasn't something she could rationalize away, even if she wanted to. And to her own surprise, she realized she didn't want to. The fantasy of one woman had offered a strange comfort. It had implied a singular rival, a problem that could be removed. This reality, this web, offered clarity instead. Because you couldn't compete with a pattern, and you couldn't fix one. Upstairs, the shower shut off. Footsteps followed. unhurried, confident. Ethan was moving through the house like a man who believed his life was still intact. Nia closed the laptop and slipped the drive into her bag, the motion smooth, practiced. She didn't feel frantic. She felt awake. For years, she had tried to understand what she was doing wrong, what she might adjust, how she could become easier to love. Now she understood the truth with devastating calm. She hadn't been married to a man who lost his way. She had been married to a man who built one, carefully, deliberately, at her expense. And once a woman recognizes a pattern, she stops blaming herself for it. She begins to plan. Nia moved away from the desk and toward the doorway, her reflection briefly catching in the darkened screen of the computer. Her face looked unchanged, composed, almost serene. But behind her eyes, something had shifted permanently. The betrayal was no longer personal. It was structural. And structures, she knew better than most, could be dismantled, piece by piece, with patience, precision, and an unwavering refusal to look away. Nia had not thought about the prenuptial agreement in years. It existed in her memory the way old compromises do, signed in a season of optimism, tucked away in a drawer of the mind labeled "Things That Will Never Matter." Back then, it had felt like formality masquerading as prudence, a legal ritual performed to appease Ethan's advisors and his family's quiet expectations. She had read it carefully, of course. She always did. But she had signed it believing, foolishly and beautifully, that love would render it irrelevant. Tonight, love had already rendered itself void. She returned to the study and opened the lower drawer of the desk, the one that required a gentle lift before it would slide free. Inside, documents lay arranged with the reverence of a man who trusted paper more than people. Tax filings, investment summaries, contracts with neat tabs. And there it was, a slim folder, cream-colored, its label typed in precise black ink. Prenuptial agreement, Carter/Caldwell. Nia removed it and carried it to the desk, the weight of the folder surprising her, not physically, but symbolically. She sat, smoothed the cover with one hand, and opened it. The language greeted her like an old acquaintance, dense, formal, confident in its own authority. Clauses marched down the page in orderly formation, each one designed to protect assets that had existed long before she had entered Ethan's life. Family holdings, trust distributions, future earnings categorized as separate property. It was all exactly as she remembered. Efficient, cold, unromantic. She read anyway, not skimming, not assuming, reading the way she read case law, slowly, deliberately, aware that the truth often hid in the spaces people believed no one would examine twice. Outside the study, the house shifted. A door opened. Footsteps moved across the upstairs floor. A voice, female, murmured something indistinct, followed by Ethan's low reply. The ordinary choreography of an ending pretending it was nothing more than a pause. Nia kept reading. Page after page affirmed what she already knew. If the marriage ended within a certain time frame, each party would leave with what they brought in. It was airtight, brutal in its fairness, the kind of agreement that rewarded legacy and punished faith. She reached the final section and felt her breath hitch, not sharply, but enough to register. Section 14.3, Conduct in Dissolution. Her eyes slowed. In the event of documented marital misconduct, including but not limited to sustained extramarital relationships that create financial, professional, or reputational risk to the non-breaching party. Nia sat straighter. The time-based limitations outlined in sections 7 through 12 shall be rendered null. Her pulse shifted, a subtle acceleration she did not try to stop. In such cases, the non-breaching party shall be entitled to equitable distribution of marital assets acquired during the marriage, including shared property, investment growth attributable to joint life decisions, and any asset in which said party holds partial legal interest. Nia read the paragraph again, then once more. She felt it then, Not triumph, not glee, but something steadier and far more dangerous: comprehension. Ethan had always spoken about the prenup with casual certainty. "It's airtight," he'd said more than once, almost kindly, as if reassuring her that nothing between them could ever become messy. He believed the agreement protected him. He believed it ensured control. What he had forgotten, what arrogance had erased from his memory, was that contracts were not moral documents. They were conditional. And conditions, once violated, changed everything. Nia turned the page, scanning for limitations, exclusions, traps. There were none that saved him. The clause was clear, deliberate, written by attorneys who had anticipated exactly this kind of man. Confident enough to break vows, careless enough to forget the consequences. She closed the folder slowly and rested her palms on top of it. Upstairs, laughter rose again, lighter now, as if the danger had passed. The woman would leave soon. Ethan would resume his performance. He would believe he was still managing the story. Nia allowed herself a single, quiet smile. Not because she wanted revenge, because she finally understood the scope of her position. For years, she had been living inside a narrative that framed her as fortunate. Fortunate to be loved by a powerful man. Fortunate to share his life. Fortunate to be chosen. The prenup had been part of that framing, an unspoken reminder of what she would lose if the marriage failed. But the agreement did not measure contribution in tenderness or patience or loyalty. It measured conduct. It measured risk. And Ethan, in his careful duplicity, had created plenty of both. She gathered the folder and slid it into her bag beside the drive and her phone. The items rested together now: facts, patterns, law. Not weapons exactly, but tools. Nia rose from the chair and stood in the center of the study, listening to the house breathe around her. She felt no urge to confront, no desire to expose him in a burst of righteous fury. That would come later, if it came at all. This moment was quieter. This moment belonged to the realization that power does not always announce itself when you first possess it. Sometimes it arrives disguised as paperwork you once signed in love, waiting patiently for the day you would need it. Nia adjusted the strap of her bag and turned toward the door. For the first time that night, she did not feel like a woman discovering betrayal. She felt like a woman who had just remembered exactly who she was, and what the law and her own clarity allowed her to do next. Nia had grown up on stories that made betrayal simple. There was always a villain, sharply drawn, a woman with careless lipstick and sharpened smiles, a woman who wanted what wasn't hers and took it with delight. Those stories were comforting in their clarity. They offered someone to hate, someone to blame, someone who could absorb the rage so the marriage itself might still be mourned as innocent. But reality, Nia was learning, had no interest in being simple. She returned to Ethan's study once more, not to gather evidence this time, but to understand. The house had gone quieter upstairs. A door opened. A woman's footsteps moved down the hall, lighter now, less certain. There was the soft rustle of fabric, the pause near the staircase, the almost hesitation of someone deciding how loudly to exist in a place that was not hers. Nia did not move toward the sound. She stayed where she was, seated at the desk, laptop open, her attention fixed on the messages bearing Avery Shaw's name. Not because Avery mattered more than the others, but because something in the tone of their exchanges refused to settle into villainy. Avery did not write like a woman who felt triumphant. Her messages were careful, often second-guessing themselves. There were ellipses, half-finished thoughts, questions left hanging. "I don't like lying. I thought you said things were almost resolved. I don't want to hurt anyone." Nia read those lines without flinching, without the jealousy she had been taught to expect. Instead, she felt a quiet, unsettling recognition. These were not the words of a woman at war. They were the words of a woman being managed. Ethan's replies were different, always had been: confident, reassuring, strategically vague. "I'm handling it. It's complicated, but I'm doing this the right way. You don't need to worry about her." Her, not a name, not a person, a logistical obstacle. Nia leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the truth arrange itself without resistance. She imagined Avery, 27, ambitious, likely praised for her intelligence and told she was mature for her age. She imagined the way Ethan would have framed himself, trapped, misunderstood, doing his best in a marriage that had become distant and transactional. Men like Ethan never position themselves as villains in their own stories. They position themselves as men waiting to be rescued. Nia opened her eyes and scrolled further. There were moments of pushback from Avery, lines where she asserted herself, where she tried to draw boundaries. Each one was met with just enough tenderness from Ethan to pull her back in. A compliment here, a promise there. Never enough to give her certainty, always enough to keep her hopeful. Hope, Nia thought, was the most exploitable resource in the world. Upstairs, the front door opened and closed softly. Avery was leaving. The house exhaled as if relieved to return to its original lie. Nia remained seated, listening to the echo of footsteps fade, wondering if Avery would step out into the night feeling chosen or diminished, or both. It would take time for her to understand which. Nia returned her gaze to the screen and found one message that stopped her completely. "I don't want to be someone you outgrow," Avery had written. Ethan's response followed minutes later. "I'm not going anywhere. I just need to end things without destroying my life." Nia felt the sentence settle into her bones. Not our life. His. In that phrasing was the entire truth of the marriage she had been living inside. She had been a role, a stabilizer, a shield against consequence. Avery was not her enemy any more than Nia herself had been foolish. They had simply been cast in different parts of the same performance, neither of them given the full script. Nia closed the laptop gently. She did not feel generous. She did not feel cruel. She felt clear. Blaming Avery would have been easy. It would have allowed Nia to preserve the illusion that Ethan's betrayal required cooperation, that her marriage had failed because another woman wanted it more. But the truth was harsher and somehow cleaner. Ethan had not been seduced away. He had been constructing exits while building cages, careful to keep every woman just hopeful enough to stay quiet. Nia rose from the chair and moved toward the window, looking out at the darkened street. Somewhere out there, Avery was likely replaying the evening, parsing words, wondering where she stood. Nia did not know if Avery would eventually feel guilt or anger or relief. What she knew was this: cartoons made betrayal entertaining. Reality made it systemic. And once Nia understood that, she stopped looking for someone else to punish. She began focusing on the man who had believed women could be rearranged without consequence, and the quiet, inevitable collapse of that belief. Because the other woman was not a monster, she was evidence. And Nia had learned, through long years of law and life, that evidence, when handled correctly, had a way of speaking far louder than rage ever could. Nia didn't go back upstairs. That was the first cruelty she refused to commit against herself, the cruelty of witnessing. The house had already shown her enough. It had offered sound and shadow, and a sentence sharp enough to cut through 8 years of excuses. She did not need the visuals. She did not need the proof of skin and sheets to make what she'd heard more real. Instead, she returned to the study and did what she had always done when the world turned dangerous. She made order out of chaos. The laptop was closed now, the evidence secured in her bag like a heartbeat she could feel through the leather. The prenup folder rested beside it, slim but heavy with consequence. The second phone sat where she'd found it, face down, pretending innocence. Outside the door, the house settled into the uneasy quiet that follows a storm no one admits happened. Upstairs, Ethan moved again. Footsteps, the muffled sound of a drawer opening, the soft rush of water as someone washed their hands. It struck Nia with bleak clarity that he was likely erasing. Not out of remorse, but out of habit. Men like Ethan didn't clean up because they felt guilty. They cleaned up because they believed they were entitled to continue. Nia opened the top drawer of the desk and found a stack of stationery. Thick cream paper embossed with Ethan's initials in a subtle, confident font. The kind of paper designed to suggest legacy even when the person using it had done nothing but inherit the posture of importance. A fountain pen lay beside it, its cap aligned parallel to the edge of the drawer. Ethan loved objects that looked expensive in silence. Nia lifted the pen and set a sheet of paper in front of her. For a moment, she simply stared at the blankness. She could have written pages. She could have poured out every quiet injury. The nights she ate dinner alone, the mornings she woke beside a man already leaving, the way she'd learned to measure love in crumbs because she was too proud to ask for a feast. She could have written about the humiliation of being called someone who always waits, about how she had turned loyalty into a discipline and still been treated like a convenience. But she didn't. She wasn't writing to persuade him. She was writing to define reality. So she wrote with restraint, each sentence clean, each word placed like a legal filing that would stand up under scrutiny. Not dramatic, not pleading, not a cry for compassion. A record, a mirror. The letter didn't take long. Nia's hand was steady, her script controlled, the lines forming with the same calm precision she used in court when she delivered closing arguments. When she finished, she read it once, only once, then folded it neatly. She chose one of Ethan's envelopes, thick and heavy, the kind that made even a single page feel like an announcement. She slid the letter inside and sealed it. The soft sound of the flap closing felt like a door lock. Upstairs, the front door clicked, quiet, careful. Avery leaving, slipping into the night with whatever version of the truth Ethan had allowed her to carry. Then Ethan's footsteps moved down the stairs. Nia listened without moving. He crossed the entryway. She could tell by the rhythm of his steps, and then went back up again, as if returning to the bedroom to reset the scene. The arrogance of it was almost breathtaking. He truly believed he could manage the narrative until he was ready to release it. Nia rose. She carried the envelope in one hand and walked down the hall with a softness that felt almost reverent, like a woman walking through a museum of her own past. The house was dim, its lights arranged for comfort. In this light, even betrayal could look like a misunderstanding if you squinted hard enough. She didn't squint. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused at the console table where the bracelet lay. It glimmered faintly, catching lamplight like it was still trying to be beautiful enough to be forgiven. Nia picked it up. The metal was warm now from the air in the room, from the place it had been resting, from the lie it had been designed to tell. She held it for a beat, then carried it with her as she climbed the stairs. Not quickly, not quietly out of fear, but quietly out of control. Outside the bedroom, she stopped. She could hear Ethan inside, moving, opening drawers, shifting linens with the brisk efficiency of someone preparing for a performance. There was no panic in the sounds, no urgency, just the steady rhythm of entitlement. Nia opened the door without ceremony. The bedroom smelled wrong. Not filthy, not obviously scandalous, just wrong in a way that made the air feel foreign, as if the room had been rented out while she was gone. The bed was rumpled despite Ethan's attempts at order, one pillow slightly displaced, a faint trace of perfume clinging to the space between the sheets. Ethan stood near the dresser, shirt half-buttoned, sleeves rolled, hair still damp at the edges. When he saw her, his face shifted through expressions too fast to trust. Surprise, calculation, a flash of something like guilt that disappeared before it could become human. "Nia," he began, voice smooth, practiced. "You're home early." He said it the way you might say the weather had changed unexpectedly. Not like a man confronted with the collapse of his vows. Not like a man who had been caught. Like a man inconvenienced. Nia didn't answer. She walked past him, her gaze steady, her movements unhurried. The calm in her body was not numbness. It was focus. She reached the bed and placed the envelope in the center of his pillow, precisely aligned, impossible to miss. Then she set the bracelet on top of it. Gold on cream paper. A gift turned into punctuation. Ethan's breath caught. "What is this?" he asked, the smoothness cracking just slightly at the edges. Nia looked at him then, not with hatred, not with tears, with the kind of quiet attention that makes a person feel exposed. As if she could see every lie he'd ever told, and no longer found any of them interesting. "You'll read it," she said, her voice gentle enough to be mistaken for kindness. "When you're alone." His eyes flicked to the envelope, then back to her. "We can talk about this," he insisted, stepping forward as if proximity still gave him power. "Whatever you think you heard," Nia's expression didn't change. "I don't need to talk," she replied softly. "I needed to know." That stopped him, because men like Ethan were trained to negotiate emotions, not facts. They could apologize for feelings. They could rationalize misunderstandings, but they could not charm their way out of evidence, out of clauses, out of a woman whose love had finally turned into clarity. Nia turned away before he could find another line. She didn't pack. She didn't gather mementos. She didn't pause to mourn. She walked to the closet, took her coat from the hook, slipped her phone into her hand, and left the room as if she were leaving a meeting that had ended. Behind her, Ethan called her name again, louder now, more urgent, the first crack of panic breaking through his composure. "Nia, wait!" But she was already walking down the stairs. Each step felt like a quiet detonation traveling through the house, shaking foundations without making a sound. In the foyer, she picked up her heels, the leather cool against her fingers, and for a moment she looked around, at the carefully arranged life, at the polished surfaces, at the home that had held her like a beautiful cage. Then she opened the front door. The night air hit her face, cold and clean, and she breathed it in like something sacred. Behind her, the house remained standing, but the story Ethan had been living inside of it was already burning, silently, completely, and this time, Nia was the one holding the match, without ever needing to strike it. Nia did not know where she was going when she stepped onto the sidewalk. She only knew where she was not going. Back into that house, back into that bed, back into the version of herself who had learned to wait, as if waiting were a form of love. The night air felt sharper than it should have, like Boston had turned the temperature down to match her new reality. Her breath came out pale and brief. Streetlights pooled gold on the pavement, turning everything soft at the edges, as if the city wanted to make what had happened feel unreal. Nia walked anyway. At first she moved on instinct, one block, then another, her heels dangling from her fingers like a life she no longer needed to perform. She could still hear Ethan's voice behind her, the sudden urgency, the attempt to grab the moment back and bend it into something he could manage. But sound faded quickly in the open air. What did not fade was the silence inside her. She found herself sitting on the steps of a closed cafe, coat wrapped tight, phone in her palm. A notification lit the screen. Ethan calling. Her thumb hovered over the accept button with a strange, almost involuntary pull. Not because she wanted him, because she wanted the pain to make sense. That was the trap, she realized. The human desire to convert devastation into dialogue. Betrayal into a conversation you could survive by speaking carefully enough. The urge to hear, "I'm sorry," said in the right tone, as if remorse could rewind time. Nia let the call ring out. The screen darkened. Another call came, then a text. "Please, just talk to me." The words appeared and sat there, small and pleading, like a man begging for mercy he had never offered. Nia stared at them until her eyes began to ache. She did not reply. She opened her contacts and scrolled to the name she trusted most. Not because the person could fix anything, but because hearing a familiar voice might keep her from doing something desperate. Tessa, her closest friend from law school. A woman who had watched Nia build herself from exhaustion and grit, who had seen her love Ethan with a devotion that bordered on reverence, who had never once said, "I told you so," even when she deserved to. Nia pressed call. When Tessa answered, her voice was sleepy and instantly alarmed. "Nia? What's wrong?" Nia tried to speak and found her throat closing around the truth. For a moment, all she could manage was breath. Then, softly, "Can I come over?" There was no pause, no questions, only the rustle of sheets and the sound of immediate movement. "Yes, right now. Where are you?" Nia told her, and within 15 minutes a car pulled up curbside. Tessa opened the passenger door before the engine had fully quieted, her eyes taking in Nia's bare hands, her missing heels, the way her posture held itself upright as if collapse were not allowed. Tessa reached across and squeezed her fingers once, firm, grounding, a wordless promise. In the car, Nia finally let herself shake, not the dramatic kind, not sobbing, not the cinematic release everyone expected from a woman betrayed. It was subtler, uglier, a tremor running through her muscles as adrenaline drained away. Her body had been in survival mode for hours. Now it was realizing it was safe enough to break. "I left," Nia whispered, as if she needed to confirm it aloud to believe it. "I left an envelope on the bed." Tessa didn't ask what the envelope said. She didn't ask if Nia was sure. She didn't ask how long it had been happening. She just nodded. "Good," she said quietly, as if the word could hold Nia up. At Tessa's apartment, the warmth hit Nia like a wave. Familiar scents, tea, lavender detergent, the faint burn of a candle. A living room arranged for comfort rather than performance. Nia stood in the doorway and felt the strangest thing, envy. Not of Tessa's life, of her peace. Tessa set a mug of chamomile tea into Nia's hands and guided her to the couch. "Drink," she said, gently firm. "Your body's still running on shock." Nia wrapped her fingers around the mug as if heat could stitch her back together. The first sip burned her tongue. She welcomed it. A physical sensation was easier than the ache that had started to spread through her chest, like ink in water. Tessa sat beside her, knees tucked up, watching without staring. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" she asked. "Or do you want to just sit?" Nia's lips parted. She expected the story to come out in rage, in humiliation, in words sharp enough to hurt him back. But what came out instead was quieter. "I heard him," she said. Her voice sounded calm, and that frightened her more than tears would have. "I didn't even see them. I just heard him." Tessa's hand covered Nia's wrist, thumb resting lightly over the skin where the bracelet had been. "What did he say?" Nia swallowed. The memory of his voice, warm, careless, arrived like a bruise touched in the dark. "He said, 'I always wait,'" Nia whispered. "Like that's who I am. Like that's all I am." Something inside her cracked then, not loudly, but completely. The tears came without warning, hot and sudden, sliding down her cheeks as if her body had been holding them back until it found a room where she wouldn't be watched. Tessa leaned in and pulled her close. No lectures, no platitudes, just presence. Nia cried quietly into Tessa's shoulder, the way grown women cry when they are not performing sadness, when there is no one to impress with resilience. The kind of crying that feels less like heartbreak and more like grief. For the years, for the hope, for the girl she had been when she signed that prenup, believing love was protection. When the tears slowed, Nia leaned back, wiping her face with the heel of her hand, embarrassed by the mess of it. "I should feel satisfied," she admitted. "I have proof. I have leverage. I have the claws. I left the letter. I walked away like I was made of steel." Her voice trembled. "But I don't feel victorious. I just feel hollow." Tessa nodded as if she had expected this exact confession. "Because you didn't win a game," she said softly. "You survived a betrayal." Nia stared at the tea in her hands, the surface trembling slightly. "I keep thinking," she whispered, "maybe I should answer him once. Just once. Not to forgive him, not to go back, just to hear him say it, to hear him admit it." Tessa's gaze sharpened, not in anger, but in protectiveness. "Nia," she said gently, "closure doesn't come from the person who broke you. It comes from you deciding you don't need their version of reality." Nia's eyes filled again, but this time the tears didn't fall. They stayed, shining, restrained. She knew Tessa was right, and still, she could feel the old habit reaching for comfort. The habit of believing that if she could just speak correctly, love would return. She set the mug down on the coffee table with careful hands, as if the sound might shatter her control. Her phone buzzed again. "Ethan." Another call. Nia picked up the phone, stared at his name, and felt something inside her revolt. Not with anger, but with fatigue. The call would not heal her. It would only pull her back into negotiation, back into the role of wife who manages the mess. Her thumb hovered. Then she turned the phone face down on the table. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was hers. Tessa stood and fetched a blanket, draping it over Nia's shoulders with the tenderness of someone who understood that strength was not the absence of needing warmth. "Sleep here," she said. "Tomorrow we make a plan. Tonight you just breathe." Nia nodded, but her mind refused to quiet. In the dark, she stared at the ceiling and listened to her own heartbeat, steady and insistent, like a drum marking a new beginning she hadn't asked for. Victory, she realized, was a word people use when they wanted pain to sound noble. But this wasn't noble. This was loss. This was the slow, aching realization that the life she had defended so fiercely was gone. Not because she failed, but because the man she loved had been living a different life inside the same walls. And yet, beneath the grief, something else flickered. Small, stubborn, unfamiliar. Not triumph, not revenge, possibility. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't waiting. She was awake. Morning arrived like an apology no one meant. Light seeped through Tessa's curtains in thin, pale strips. And for a few quiet seconds, Nia forgot where she was. Her body lay heavy beneath the blanket, aching in the places where tension had lived all night. Then memory returned, swift and merciless, and the ache sharpened into something clearer. She sat up slowly, as if sudden movement might disturb the fragile new reality she had built by leaving. Tessa was already awake, moving through the kitchen with the calm competence of someone who knew crisis well enough not to dramatize it. A mug of coffee appeared in Nia's hands, a plate of toast, small comforts offered without questions, because questions could wait. Nia's phone, face down on the coffee table, looked like a sleeping animal. When she turned it over, it woke. Notifications bloomed across the screen. Missed calls from Ethan, messages from unknown numbers, emails that had multiplied overnight. Her stomach tightened. Not fear exactly, something closer to the dread of stepping into a courtroom where you already know the opposing counsel plans to make you look like the villain. The first email was from a partner at a law firm she recognized, Ethan's World. "Miss Carter, we represent Mr. Caldwell. We request immediate communication to resolve this matter privately and amicably." Privately, amicably, words that always sounded civilized until you noticed how often they were used to silence women. Then came the texts from numbers she didn't know. "You're really doing this? He said you're trying to destroy him. This is messy, Nia. Don't embarrass yourself." She stared at the last message until the letters blurred. Embarrass yourself, as if betrayal belonged to her reputation, not his behavior. Tessa leaned against the doorway, watching Nia's face. "It's starting," she said quietly. Nia didn't reply. She couldn't, not yet. Because the strangest part was how quickly the world had chosen its version of events. She hadn't posted anything. She hadn't called a reporter. She hadn't even told more than one person. She had simply left, and left a letter that belonged, morally and legally, inside the confines of their marriage. And still, the rumor mill had found her like blood in water. By noon, the first call came from her office. Not from a close friend, not from someone checking on her, from a colleague with a voice too careful, too professionally concerned. "Nia," he began, and she heard the preamble before the words. The soft approach, the way people speak when they are about to tell you to shrink yourself for your own good. I'm hearing some things." Nia sat at Tessa's kitchen table, fingers wrapped around her coffee. "What things?" she asked, her voice steady. A pause. "That you and Ethan are having a situation, that there's a divorce filing, and that it might get public." Nia almost laughed at the word might, as if public attention were a weather forecast rather than a weapon. She exhaled. "I'm handling it," she said. Her colleague hesitated. "I'm sure you are, but you know how this goes. People are already saying, well, that you're being ruthless. Ruthless, the word slid under her skin like a splinter. She had watched men pursue profit without mercy and be called ambitious. She had watched them take credit for women's work and be called leaders. She had watched them bulldoze through other people's lives and be praised for decisiveness. But when a woman finally used power, real power, documented power, lawful power, she became ruthless. What exactly does ruthless mean? Nia asked softly. When the evidence is real. Another pause, longer this time. It means, he said carefully, that some people think you're overreacting, that you're trying to make an example out of him. Nia's throat tightened, not with sadness, but with anger so clean it felt like ice. Overreacting, as if she were responding to a rude comment, not a systematic betrayal. As if she were a woman with feelings, not a woman with facts. She thanked him, ended the call, and sat in the sudden quiet. Tessa crossed the room and placed a hand on her shoulder, a grounding weight. "They're scared," Tessa murmured, "not of you being wrong, of you being effective." Nia closed her eyes. Effective, yes, that was always the real offense. She opened her email again and found more messages. Old acquaintances, people who had smiled at fundraisers, who had once called her inspiring. Their tone had shifted overnight into polite distance. "Hope you're okay. Praying for peace. Maybe it's best not to escalate." Escalate, as if she had started the fire. Then came the one that made her hands go cold. A forwarded thread from someone at Ethan's firm, an inadvertent leak, a mistake made by a nervous assistant. In it, text, Ethan's voice appeared in text, filtered through someone else's retelling, but still unmistakable. "She's calculating. She's always been calculating. She's doing this because she wants to punish me. You know how she is, cold, controlled. She's using the law as revenge." Nia stared at the words until her mind went oddly still. Cold, controlled. He was trying to turn her strengths into defects. He was rewriting her into a stereotype. The ambitious black woman who must be manipulative. The successful wife who must be emotionally unavailable. The woman who uses power because she doesn't know how to love. And the world, eager for a story it understood, was already nodding along. In that moment, Nia felt something shift again. Not the switch from heartbreak to strategy, but the deeper shift from strategy to conviction. Because she realized what the backlash truly was. It wasn't about Ethan. It was about the discomfort people felt when a woman refused to be small in her pain. They liked strong women when strength looked like endurance. When it looked like smiling through neglect, maintaining composure, forgiving quietly, moving on without disturbing anyone's comfort. They praised resilience when it was passive. But the moment strength became action, lawyers, filings, consequences, people started calling it vengeance. They wanted her to be dignified, which was another way of saying quiet. Nia stood from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the city beyond Tessa's apartment. Boston moved with its usual rhythm, indifferent to the private wars happening behind its doors. Cars slid past. People carried coffee. Someone laughed on the sidewalk. Life continued. And yet, in Nia's world, the air felt newly charged. She was no longer fighting only a husband's betrayal. She was fighting a narrative that excused men's entitlement and punished women's clarity. A narrative that told her to be graceful in a way that benefited everyone except her. She turned back to Tessa, her eyes bright and steady. "I'm not going to shrink," she said quietly. Tessa nodded once, approval sharp in her gaze. "Good," she replied, "because shrinking won't save you. It'll just make them more comfortable while they bury you." Nia's phone buzzed again. Another message, this one from a number she didn't recognize. "If you cared about him, you wouldn't do this." Nia read it, and something inside her settled like a stone at the bottom of a clear lake. If she cared, as if caring meant surrender, as if love required martyrdom. She placed the phone down and let the silence fill the room. In that silence, she understood the true cost of using power. Not the legal fees, not the gossip, not the uncomfortable conversations. The cost was being seen differently. Not as inspiring, not as admirable, but as dangerous. And Nia Carter, who had spent her life fighting for people the world wanted to ignore, looked at that new label, dangerous, and did not flinch. Because if the world could only love a strong woman when her strength was convenient, then the world had never loved strength at all. It had only loved her compliance. Nia lifted her chin, feeling her spine align, feeling her breath deepen. Let them talk. Let them whisper. Let them misunderstand. She would not waste her remaining softness trying to prove her pain was valid. She had evidence. She had law. And she had the kind of quiet power that didn't ask permission to exist. The backlash could come. She would still move forward, steady, unedited, and entirely unwilling to make herself smaller to fit anyone else's comfort ever again. By the third morning, Nia understood something essential. Silence could be powerful, but strategy required speech. Not confession, not justification, precision. She sat at Tessa's kitchen table with her laptop open and a legal pad beside it, the steam from her coffee thinning into the air. The city outside had settled into its weekday tempo. Deliveries, horns, the rhythm of lives continuing without regard for reputations being quietly dismantled. Nia listened to that rhythm and matched it with her own breathing, slow and deliberate, the way she did before a hearing that mattered. She called her attorney first. Claire picked up on the second ring, voice clear, awake, unsurprised. "I was waiting," she said. "Tell me everything." Nia did. Not in a rush, not with embellishment. She laid out the pattern, the devices, the messages, the clause. She named Avery, but she named Ethan more. She separated what could be proven from what could be implied, what mattered legally from what mattered emotionally. When she finished, there was a pause, short, impressed. "All right," Claire said. "Here's what we're going to do." What followed was not vengeance. It was architecture. They would file quietly, with evidence attached. No leaks, no theatrics. The prenup clause would do its work without commentary. The marital assets would be addressed precisely. Growth, properties, accounts tied to joint decisions. The request would be firm and limited to what the agreement allowed. No overreach, no drama. And then there was the matter of the workplace. Nia had anticipated this part. It sat in her chest like a held breath. "I don't want to burn down a woman to expose a man," she said carefully. "Avery isn't a cartoon villain. If there's a power imbalance, and there is, I want it handled without turning her into collateral." Claire hummed softly. "That's not mercy," she said. "That's good law." They discussed options, an ethics complaint framed around conduct, not scandal. Protections for employees who might come forward, a separation between personal divorce filings and professional accountability. It was slower this way, harder. It required restraint when rage would have been simpler. Nia chose restraint because she refused to be the only one punished, refused to let the story resolve as wife leaves, man survives, woman absorbs the fallout. She had seen that ending too many times. She had argued against it in courtrooms that smelled of old wood and indifference. After the call, Nia closed the laptop and sat back, surprised by the quiet satisfaction settling into her bones. Not triumph, alignment. The next step was harder. She opened her email and drafted a message to her firm's managing partners. She kept it brief, factual, calm. She disclosed what she needed to disclose, named the steps she was taking, asserted her commitment to professionalism. She did not apologize. She did not preemptively defend herself. She pressed send and felt the small tremor that followed. A familiar sensation, the one that came when you stopped trying to control other people's reactions and focused on your own integrity instead. By afternoon, the calls shifted. The tone changed from warning to negotiation. A representative from Ethan's firm reached out, voice smooth, practiced. "We're hoping to resolve this without unnecessary exposure," he said. "These things can get messy. Everyone loses." Nia listened, then replied with courtesy sharpened into steel. "Everyone loses when consequences are avoided," she said. I'm not interested in unnecessary exposure. I'm interested in accurate outcomes. There was a silence on the line. Surprise. Recalibration. She ended the call without further explanation. Later, alone for the first time since she left the house, Nia stood in Tessa's spare room and opened her bag. She removed the drive, the folder, the phone with its copied images. She laid them on the bed like a map, evidence not as a threat, but as a boundary. She allowed herself a moment then, not to cry, to grieve. Not for Ethan, for the version of herself who had believed dignity meant endurance, who had been proud of how much she could take without complaint, who had mistaken patience for virtue and silence for peace. That woman had loved deeply, and she had paid for it. Nia sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms together, grounding herself in the present. She felt the ache of backlash waiting just beyond the door. Whispers, editorials, the careful distancing of people who once praised her. She knew the next months would not be gentle, but they would be honest. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan, routed through a new number. "We can fix this. You don't have to do all of this." Nia stared at the screen, then typed once, precisely. "I'm not fixing what I didn't break." She blocked the number. As evening fell, Tessa returned with groceries and a look of quiet approval. "You look different," she said, setting bags down. "Tired, but anchored." Nia smiled faintly. "I decided something today." Tessa waited. "I'm done being reasonable in ways that only protect men," Nia said. "I'll be fair. I'll be lawful. I'll be measured. But I won't be small." Tessa nodded. "Good. Small was never you." That night, as Nia lay awake, the city's sounds rising and falling beyond the window, she thought about punishment, how the word had been used against her as a threat, a warning, as if holding someone accountable were a cruelty. She understood now. Refusing to be the only one punished was not revenge. It was balance. And balance, once restored, had a way of making lies collapse under their own weight. Nia closed her eyes and let the day settle, her resolve firm and quiet. The countermove had been made. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would last. 1 year later, the ocean woke her before her alarm did. Nia lay still for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm beyond the open window, the tide rising and withdrawing with the patience of something that had survived far worse than heartbreak. Morning light spread across the room in soft layers, touching the bookshelf she'd built herself, the desk by the window where unfinished ideas waited without urgency, the quiet proof of a life no longer arranged around someone else's absence. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She didn't reach for it immediately. That, she realized, was the difference. Eventually, she turned her head and glanced at the screen. An unfamiliar number. One message. "Happy birthday, Nia. I hope you're well. I've thought a lot about everything. I know I don't deserve it, but I wanted to say, I'm sorry. Ethan." The message sat there, small and carefully phrased, as if regret could be compressed into a polite paragraph and offered without consequence. Nia picked up the phone and read it once. She felt nothing. No spike of anger, no ache of nostalgia, not even satisfaction, just a distant recognition, like seeing a name on an old plaque in a building you no longer enter. She deleted the message. Then she turned the phone face down and got out of bed. The kitchen smelled like fresh coffee and clean wood. Outside, gulls called to one another over the water. Nia poured herself a cup, wrapped her hands around the mug, and stepped onto the small deck she'd learned to love. Below her, the shoreline curved gently, unchanged by human drama, indifferent to reputations and apologies. This was her 34th birthday, not marked by flowers sent too late, not by gifts designed to distract, not by a dinner reservation meant to cover distance. It was marked by presence. A year ago, she had believed survival would be the hard part. She'd been wrong. Survival was instinct. Building was choice. The year had not been gentle. There were weeks when the backlash was loud, opinion dressed up as concern, silence dressed up as neutrality. There were days when starting over felt lonelier than staying ever had. But there were also mornings like this one, when she woke up whole, unafraid of her own thoughts. Her work had changed. She still practiced law, but now she chose her cases differently. She'd started a small, legal initiative, quiet, intentional, helping women navigate separations where power and money had once been used as leverage against them. Not revenge, reconstruction. She'd learned that freedom wasn't dramatic. It was consistent. It was choosing herself again and again until the choice stopped feeling radical and started feeling normal. Later that afternoon, friends would arrive. There would be laughter, food cooked without performance, stories that didn't orbit a man's approval. There might even be music. There might be dancing. Nothing extravagant, nothing curated for outsiders, just life, unfolding. Nia looked out at the water and thought of the woman she had been 1 year ago, standing in a quiet house, realizing that waiting had become a habit she no longer wanted to keep. She felt tenderness for that woman now, not pity, respect, because she had walked away without screaming, without begging, without asking permission to protect herself. She had chosen clarity over comfort, and that choice had changed everything. Nia finished her coffee, turned back inside, and opened her laptop. There was work to do, plans to refine, letters to draft, futures to shape. The world did not pause for healing, but it did make room for people who showed up whole. Before she closed the screen, she smiled softly to herself. Some endings arrive wrapped in noise. Hers had arrived in silence and built a life loud with meaning. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt the quiet moment when everything changes, take a second to let that be known. Like the story, share your thoughts in the comments and follow along for more stories about choosing yourself, rebuilding with grace, and discovering that the strongest exits are often the quietest ones. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is delete the message and build the life anyway.